Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cold Coffee ELT Podcast. My name is Nataliia Naradovska-Reese, and I've been teaching in language schools and as a private tutor for over 13 years. Here with me today is Christopher Reese, a CELTA and Delta Module 1 trainer who has had experience managing English schools in 2 continents and currently works as the Director of Studies of an ELT program at a Bell English Partner School. Hello, Chris.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So today we're going to be talking about the topic that we decided on, which was teaching in different contexts.
Right, yeah.
So I guess we can start off by running through my background and experience in different contexts. Then we can talk a little bit about yours, because we've got experience teaching in very different contexts.
Yeah, that's true.
So if we talk about the kinds of experience in teaching that I've got, that would be mostly in international language schools, although I do work in a mainstream secondary school now as the head of their, as one of their EFL department heads.
Right, yeah.
So that means that that's teaching young learners, primary, early secondary, also experience teaching corporate clients, business English. What I did the most of throughout my career actually is exam preparation. So working with preparation towards usually Cambridge main suite exams. So first, advanced, and proficiency, as well as a bit of IELTS prep, SAT prep, TOEFL prep here and there, but mostly Cambridge main suite. Right. And yeah, then as well, I guess if we add in the other experience, I've also worked as a CELT primary and a CELT secondary trainer when these courses were still being run by Cambridge. Working with teachers who work in mainstream secondary and primary context, as well as, like we said, the CELTA and Delta Module 1 trainer. And I've had the fortune of being able to work with trainees from over 20 different countries over the last 4 years while I'm doing that. So yeah, lots of different contexts, and you've got very different experience to me as well.
Yeah, well, I consider myself to be mostly a one-to-one teacher. However, I also have quite big experience in teaching groups. And I've been working with business clients as well. I've also been doing a lot of exam preparation, especially the NO preparation. And Cambridge exams, PET, that's B1 and B2 FC. Yeah, so because the world is changing basically not every day, but I think every second, today we've decided to talk about teaching in different contexts, because this is what a lot of us are going to experience in the nearest future. So question number 1, Chris, what do we mean by teaching in different contexts?
Well, to me, I think the first thing that lots of people are going to think about when they think of teaching in different contexts is they're going to think about teaching in different cultures. So, for example, right now, both of us, we live in Thailand, and my students are Thai secondary students, and Thai secondary students are very different from Ukrainian secondary students, who are very different from American secondary students, who are very different from, German or Spanish secondary students. So this is probably one of the first things that people think about when they think about teaching in different contexts, would be cultural context. But when we talk about different contexts, we don't only mean different cultures. We could mean different age groups. So for example, primary, early secondary, adult students could be older learners, people who have experience working with like the 50, 60-year-old learner group, which there are quite a few of. It could be studying for different purposes. So it could be something like, well, are you teaching general English? Are you teaching exam prep, business English? Are you teaching English for specific purposes? Are you maybe preparing people to take jobs in the hospitality industry, for example, where there's lots of very specific ELT classes, especially if you go to like resort destinations and holiday destinations like, I don't know, Tijuana or
right, yeah.
So when we talk about teaching in different contexts, it could also be like you mentioned earlier, one-to-one versus group settings. And even if we talk about group settings, we could talk about small group settings, 5, 10, 15 students, which I would still consider to be rather small groups. Or are we talking about large group settings like you do see in some places, 40, 50 students packed into one classroom? And this is something that's really important, because this really affects not how the students learn, but some of the things that we might choose to do in the classroom, and some of the things we might be able to do very well, some of the things that we might actually be limited by in our teaching.
Could you tell me a little bit more about different contexts you've been working in, especially including teacher training work?
Right. So teacher training work, if we start with that, I started my teacher training career working as a CELT secondary tutor. I later transitioned into CELT primary once I felt a little bit more confident teaching primary age students. And what this entailed was working with teachers who were mostly coming from state school backgrounds. The CELT-S was a blended course that Cambridge recently stopped offering. But one of the advantages of the CELT-S and the CELT-P was that it offered a very good education. The course itself was very cheap. I mean, not very, very cheap, but it was cheap enough that an average school teacher could afford to do it and didn't feel like it was this crazy amount of money.
I still believe that it was one of the best courses, teacher training courses for wild teachers.
For what people paid for it, especially if you compared it to something like the TILEC or other kind of equivalent courses, it was a very good course. It's a shame that Cambridge sent away with it. And that entailed, well, working with the teachers, actually going to their classrooms and going to their schools and observing them working with their students. So that gave me a pretty good understanding of at least what Ukrainian secondary school teachers and primary school teachers deal with on a daily basis, because we were going into the schools and observing them and helping them work there. So it's not like they were coming to a nice, clean, pretty language center with all of the technology and everything available. That being said, I've also got the experience working as a CELTA trainer, which is preparation for teaching adult learners, even though many people with CELTAs do go on to teach kids afterwards. And this means that we have teachers coming from, when I started working as a CELTA trainer, it was pre-pandemic. I started working as a CELTA trainer in 2018. It's when I got trained up. My first course as an independent tutor after my training up process was in August 2018. And that was back when everything was fully offline. So we had teachers coming from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to the center where I worked in Kiev. We had trainees from the UK, from Ireland, from France, from Germany. And now with the online CELTA, this kind of diversity of contexts is even, I would say, becoming even more. Yeah, because we've got of course, we have lots of trainees, because the center that that I've done the most work with, both centers that I've done the most work with in my life, they were both located in Kiev. So obviously the majority of the trainees there were Ukrainian, but we still had people from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, from France, from Germany, from Poland, from you name it. We had trainees zooming into us from China. And as well, kind of the chance to work with tutors also come from different backgrounds, because even if you talk about like the tutors that we've worked with, even that we've had on CELTA courses where I've worked, it's been not only kind of American and British and Ukrainian, it's also been Brazilian. We've worked with trainers from Poland. We've worked with trainers who have had significant amounts of experience teaching in places like Thailand. One of my mentors, Helen Taradenko, she spent a long time working in Singapore. So even kind of outside of my own teaching experience, working with language learners in the US and in Ukraine and in Thailand, there's also a bit more experience, especially when we look at kind of the groups of teachers who we have coming to us.
Right. So why is awareness of different contexts is important?
Well, because you can't always take a lesson which works really, really well for one context and just impose it on another and expect things are going to work. I can give you a really good example of this. So a little bit of background. Right now, the school where I work, on my day-to-day job, it's a Thai secondary school, which means that I work with Thai early secondary students. They've got a slightly different division of grades here, but
how old are your students?
Well, they come to our program at about 11, 12 years old. And they leave about 14, 15 years old. So we focus on this particular range of ages in our program. if you take, for example, a Ukrainian, I'm just going to use a Ukrainian example because that's where I've got the most experience. If you take a Ukrainian secondary student and you give him a task and he's not entirely sure what to do, well, usually if he's a decent student, he's going to try to do what you asked him. He's going to do something. He'll try to do what you asked him to do. Now, you might not do it right, you may have to come help him, but you're going to see an attempt there, especially if it's a decent student. If we compare that with the average Thai student, even a good student, if you give them instructions what to do and they don't really understand what to do, they won't even touch the page. Even if they're a good student, they'll just look at it and they won't do anything. But it's because in their educational system, there's such an emphasis on not making mistakes and being marked and penalized so heavily for their mistakes that if I'm not sure, and this is the perspective, is that if I'm not sure what to do, and I think that I'm running the risk of making a mistake, it's better not to do anything. Because if I don't do anything, I can't make a mistake and I can't get it wrong.
To be honest, I think that it applies to other countries as well, because
Sure.
I myself have a student from Azerbaijan, and the girl, basically, she's also afraid of the same, of making mistakes. And if she's not sure which answer to choose, she will choose not to do anything. So kind of one really important thing when you deal with these with cultures where, for example, the idea of face saving is important, because that's what it boils down to. And this is in very many cultures throughout the world where face saving is considered important. You want to always avoid the possibility of letting someone be wrong publicly. And if they are wrong publicly, you deal with it in a way such that they don't lose face and they don't lose reputation. So you've got to be very sensitive. So, for example, one thing which Ukrainian teachers I've seen mostly do, you'll probably recognize this as well, is how many mistakes do you have? And asking that sort of question in many contexts would be like the ultimate taboo. Like, you're asking me to not just lose face in front of everyone, but you're asking me to purposefully sacrifice my face in front of everyone. So little issues like this. And for example, for a Ukrainian teacher who's worked their whole life with Ukrainian students, where this is the done thing in many schools, they wouldn't think twice about it. But if they went to work in a culture which is like the one that I've described, they would run into some really big problems really soon. So my question becomes, how do we go about it? What can we do to solve this problem?
Well, I think when it comes to so let's start with the idea of cross-cultural awareness. I think the first port of call, anytime a teacher starts working with students from an unfamiliar culture, is to find colleagues who are familiar with them and to sit down and talk with them about what works with these students, what doesn't work with these students. Now, that doesn't mean that we throw out our training. And this is a big misconception that I hear lots of times from teachers. I can give some examples of this. In my experience, I'm not going to name any particular cultures, but in my experience, there are students from some cultures who do really, really well when you give them individual work. And they'll excel if it's something they can do on their own. They'll happily do this. But if you give them the opportunity to work or a task that requires collaboration, they really struggle with this. And this is very often because their educational system doesn't value collaboration. They're probably used to being tested more than they're being taught. They're not used to collaborative systems of learning. And if you ask them to collaborate, it's not only that they won't do it, they won't even have an idea of where to start. And the problem with this,
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about myself actually, because I was taught that way at school, and we didn't do much of collaboration, unfortunately, because I think it's something that really boosts.
Yeah, which is a shame. And that's something as well that when you read any of the research or the modern thought and the 21st century skills, like what do people need in the workplace of the future?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things the workplace of the future is going to need in most places is collaboration, because the days of people going and working a factory job where they're going to sit at their spot on the assembly line and press their button every day,
Mm-hmm.
those days in lots of places in the world are finishing. And especially if we look at learners who might be aiming to have high-level professional jobs in the future, and many of those are our students in language classes,
Mm-hmm.
because people whose aspirations are to do kind of manual labor or a job like this throughout their life, well, it's not that they don't need foreign languages. It's not that they're not interested in foreign languages. It's just that if you look at the broad statistics, mm-hmm. you're probably going to find less of these people enrolled in private language schools for whatever reason. It could be because the tuition's too high. It could be any number of reasons. But at the end of the day, they're not going to make a big percentage of your student population, most likely. There are some exceptions, like mm-hmm. the agricultural university in Sumy in mm-hmm. Ukraine, which prepares people to get their A2 exams for migrants, so they can get migrant farming visas. Like, so this does happen. It's just less frequent mm-hmm. if we look at kind of the broad scope of things. So you'll hear some people say, well, these students don't do very good with collaboration. I think there's a right way and a wrong way to interpret that. I think the wrong way to interpret that is, okay, they're not good at collaboration, so we shouldn't do anything collaborative, but let's give them individual work. Well, not really, because if we look at even relevant hypotheses, like how we learn languages, well, we can point to the output hypothesis, which says that I need to learn a language, I need the opportunity to produce language which is meaningful and where I need to be really careful about the message that I provide. Mm-hmm. Well, if I'm not talking to another human being, that's going to be really hard to do. Or if we look at, say, we pick a different line of theory and we say, okay, the interaction hypothesis from Michael Long, if I remember correctly, which says that, okay, well, language is learned through the negotiation of meaning between two people, trying to understand what the other person is trying to say and come to some sort of conclusion. Well, okay, but if I'm not talking to another person, I'm not negotiating anything. I can't negotiate with myself.
Yeah.
That's typically not something that's very positively on when people start negotiating with themselves. Even if I look at something which is a bit more recent, if we turn into kind of general education theory, something like the interface hypothesis, mm-hmm. which says that, well, there's two. There's the interface hypothesis and the reverse interface hypothesis. But basically, both of these say that my knowledge of rules mm-hmm. allows me to make good examples, and the feedback or the examples that I see inform my knowledge of the rules. So it creates a feedback loop. Well, if I'm never encountering examples through conversation with others, I'm never getting feedback on my examples, this feedback loop gets broken. So if we talk about language learning, it really doesn't matter what, to some degree, mm-hmm. what framework or theory of learning we're ascribing to. We could even go into the input hypothesis. Well, conversation with other people is a wonderful source of comprehensible input. Or even the sociocultural hypothesis, which says that I learn from people who do something better than me. Well, if I don't talk to anyone, good luck finding someone better than you. So it doesn't matter what theory of learning you want to come across. Mm-hmm. You get to this point that collaboration is important. So to me, the idea that we might eschew or skip collaboration because they're not very good at it, mm-hmm. that doesn't seem like a great answer to me. I would say that the answer would instead be that we need to scaffold collaboration, and we need to really teach them what it means to collaborate and how to do it. Mm-hmm. One really good example of this is even something as simple as checking their answers in pairs mm-hmm. for open class, which gives them a chance to peer teach. But very often what happens when you say check in pairs, the students don't know how to do it. They swap their papers, they look, and it's teacher, all good. It's like, well, that's not really what I wanted you to do, though.
This is actually a very popular problem that a lot of teachers who, for example, do the CELTA course, then go back to their classrooms and they want to introduce this pair mm-hmm. work if they have never done that before. Mm-hmm. and they see that students actually can't work in pairs.
Yeah.
And they say that pair work doesn't work.
Yeah.
So again, the question is, how do we solve this?
Well, I'm going to peel back the curtain a little bit because I can tell you the origin of this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from the fact that if you do a CELTA course, you do teach real students, real trainees. There's a big but, though. Lots of the students have been students on TP groups for CELTA more than once.
Yeah.
Because what happens is basically most centers who offer these classes, because one of the big concerns with the CELTA is recruiting TP students. This is something that every center struggles with, because if you've got a group of, I mean, just to give you an idea of numbers, it's like, let's say I'm running a part-time CELTA course and I've got 4 TP groups. I've got 24 trainees, which is great. I've got a really big course for my center. I need to find somewhere around 40 to 50 students. Right. Well, lots of people who do the courses, well, to find 40 to 50 students relatively quickly, well, I'm probably not charging them lots of money. And considering that there are trainee teachers on this course anyways, who are, some of them are going to be great. Some of them are definitely going to take a while to become great. So you don't want to charge these students an exorbitant amount of money.
Of course,
because that's also not very ethical. So basically what you wind up getting are very cheap English classes, which comes to another point, by the way. If anyone knows anyone looking for cheap English courses, find a center that runs the CELTA and ask them when they need TP students, because usually it's very cheap, if not free, to attend, because it's just a matter of the fact that they need more bodies. But because of this, you also get lots of students who find out about these cheap or free English classes, and they come multiple times, even if it's the same program.
Sorry to interrupt you here. I actually had the same story. When I was doing my CELTA course, there was one TP student, a woman who was in my elementary group. And then when I came to work for the center, she actually was my student in a pre-intermediate class. So what happened, because she basically went to this courses, so to say, multiple times, as you've said, every year, she knew subconsciously, I think, the framework of the lesson. And so what happened, she would be in the class, and they, for example, were doing some exercise, control practice, and then as soon as she finished, she would ask me, okay, so now we check in pairs. And she would say every time what we are going to do next and next and next. And that's...
But it becomes this, because what's happened is that she's become so used to the routine, and she's been trained how to do it. And so when you look at, for example, my learners now, who many of them come into my classroom without being trained. So when you say check in pairs, or what they might be used to at most is swapping papers and marking their partner's paper. But that's testing. That's not teaching. It's not what we're after. So one of the ways that I deal with this in the classroom, it's not my idea, actually. I took this from Chris Rowland, actually, from his book, his wonderful YL Guru. And it's such a devilishly simple idea, as are all of his ideas, because he's brilliant, which is to teach them a dialogue to check in pairs. And it's something very simple. It's, what do you think about number 1? Oh, I think it's A. What do you think? Oh, good idea. Or I'm not sure. I think it's this.
So what, you like drill this conversation with your students?
Yes.
Don't they look surprised at you at first? Like, teacher, what are you talking about? What do you want from me?
Well, what I do first, the way that I do it is I demonstrate it. So I keep this dialogue on the board, and it stays on the board or somewhere visible in the classroom until I never have to reference it. Like, and it may go back up later if I see that I'm still referencing it again. So I leave it somewhere that the students can see it. In an offline classroom. In an online classroom, you just basically have to remind them all the time. But what I do is I'll do the first one, I'll model it. So I'll pick a stronger student, I'll point to the dialogue and I'll say, okay, what do you think about number one? They'll say, okay, I think it's the what do you think? So we go through the dialogue together.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'll pick another student for number two. I'll say, okay, you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll intentionally get the answer wrong so that they have to correct me and say what the right answer is.
Mm-hmm.
So then we check, drill the dialogue all together. Okay, now can you all do the same in pairs?
Mm-hmm.
Once they've got an idea of what to do, because now it comes back to this point of, if I don't know what to do, I'm not going to do anything.
Right.
Well, now I know what to do. I know what to say. I know what my teacher expects of me. So now I can do it.
How much time does it take to train students to work in pairs?
Depends on the group. Depends on where you're starting from.
Mm-hmm.
I would say a minimum of 1 month.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's 1 month if you're lucky.
Okay.
And this is assuming that they've never been trained to do it. And I don't mean you've got a group where half of them are used to working in pairs and half of them aren't, because that sorts itself out really quickly. The ones who are used to it, knock the others in line pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you've got a group where it's not part of the culture and you are introducing it to be part of the culture of the group, I would say a minimum of 1 month,
mm-hmm.
being very consistent. And you will probably have to drill that dialogue to check in pairs every single day for that month. But once you do, you're going to see dividends. Because if they can do that in pairs, they can do basically anything else in pairs. And you can start adding bits onto your dialogue once they get better at it. So once they've got the basic one down, you can add the question, why do you think that?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, can you show me? So you can add more questions, get them to work together more productively as they go along. And once they're trained, I mean, we took, just to give you an idea, and this was admittedly a stronger group, that they all got on well and they took pretty quickly to pair work, even though it took them a little bit longer. We started off and they really struggled with even checking in pairs. After a month, we got them checking in pairs. After 6 weeks, I gave them a guided discovery worksheet for grammar last week to do in pairs.
Okay.
And it's not just that they did it, they, I would say, excelled at it.
All right. So it takes time and patience from the teacher.
Yeah, and you also got to expect that it's not going to be a linear process either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're going to get it right some days, and then the next day the same exact thing, and they'll get it wrong, and you'll think, guys, yesterday you did it just fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's not a linear process. It's going to go up. It's going to go 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but eventually everyone gets there.
Right. It's still 2 steps forward.
Right.
Okay. So next question: what sort of homework should I, as a teacher, do before going into a classroom where I'm going to work in probably a different context, which I have never done before?
Well, let's maybe separate this into what to do if I'm going to be teaching in a different culture versus what to do if I'm going to be teaching a different type of class. I think a different type of class is in some ways more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll explain why. So let's start with different culture. I think, as I said before, step one would be to talk to people who have experience teaching that culture, because they're going to give you a lot of advice. And if you know other teachers who have worked in that context for a while, just ask them, what are some things that you do that works?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are some little tips that you can give me? Like, little practical things. Now, that doesn't mean that you should base all of your teaching around these things, but you'll probably be able to pick out some little principles like that. I'd say the second is to be very much aware of things like cultural taboos.
Mm-hmm. Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, whether or not you should count with your palm facing the students, like 1, 2, 3, 4, or with your palm facing away from the students, 1, 2, 3, 4, because some cultures count differently, and in some cultures it's very rude to count with your palm facing the others. Or things like, is it okay to put things on the floor? Is it okay to touch people's heads? Is it okay to...
Even the distance between students and teacher.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that If we talk about students in lots of cultures, in my experience, this has been with lots of students from Asian cultures, is that they may not make eye contact with you. And in I'll reference my own culture because I'm American. So in America, if an authority figure is talking with you, you're expected to maintain eye contact with them. And not maintaining eye contact could be taken as a sign of guilt or shame or avoidance or lack of engagement. Whereas
hiding something from them.
Right. Whereas in some cultures, it could be a sign of deference. It could be a sign that they respect you as a superior.
As here, for example.
Yeah.
They do in Thailand.
Yeah. And I've noticed that, for example, if I'm telling off a Thai student because they've done something a bit naughty and I have to tell them off, they won't make eye contact with me. Because
even I noticed that, for example, when you talk to them, when you start a conversation saying hello and everything, they usually nod and they don't look you in the eyes.
And some of them will, once they've got a good rapport with it. Once they've got a good rapport with you, and once you've got a good connection with them. Like with my students, the majority of them will make eye contact with me, and we get on really, really well with each other.
You know that, yes.
Right. But even then, if it switches from teacher as friend to teacher as authority figure, they also sense that, and you'll see them avoid eye contact immediately.
They also speak very quietly at first.
That's
another,
and because again, that's this kind of fear of making mistakes. And I think the other thing to recognize with cross-cultural differences is that it's not that because I think one thing that we need to be very careful of when we talk about this is not to other the students. And by other, I'm going to take the terminology of Edward Said, not to orientalize them. I don't mean orientalize them like Oriental meaning of Asian. I mean orientalize in the term of view them as some sort of other who is intrinsically different from me, because they're not, they're people. And every single trend that I've described about Thai students, you absolutely see with Ukrainian students, just a bit less frequently. So it's not a matter of all of the students are like this, it's a numbers game. It's that, well, okay, you will see more students like this here, and you'll probably see less students like this, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. And the number is going to be far from 100%. I think that's also very encouraging for a teacher who's going to work in different cultures, is that as long as you can find the red lines and you don't cross any of them, you'll find that there's many more similarities than there are differences at the end of the day. So that's teaching in different cultures. We talk about teaching different types of classes. I think this can be a bit more challenging because this is going to require a little bit of research. Let's take, for example, let's imagine, for example, I'm transitioning from teaching general English to teaching business English. And this is a very difficult transition for lots of people to make. It's why very few people make it. And why, well, lots of people who do become, let's say, effective business English tutors, well, it's very lucrative. Because the companies typically have lots of money to pay these people. But you're going to have to learn lots of things.
Yeah, a lot of teachers also see this as a much bigger responsibility.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm not sure that I agree that it's more responsibility. I think that you see the responsibility. Because
not like with general English students.
Yeah, because with general English, someone could absolutely be studying in a general English class for all the same reasons that they're in a business English class. You just don't know it. So I think the responsibility is the same, but it's certainly much more visible. And you may have greater demands placed upon you in a business English environment. For example, you may be expected to dress in a way. Well, for example, I've worked traditionally in language schools where the dress code was, well, there was a dress code, but it was pretty relaxed. You could wear jeans to the office, you could wear a t-shirt as long as it was clean. You didn't have to wear a shirt and a tie and slacks and everything. Now, of course, I do wear that to the office. But in most language schools, you'll find a more relaxed culture, and lots of them. Whereas if teachers from this relaxed culture go into a business English classroom in the same shirt and jeans and sneakers, they may not be respected by the students, who might have a certain expectation of the teacher who is dressed like a certain way and looks like this, or it's a man. They may expect them to be in slacks and a proper shirt, maybe not in a tie, although that could be the case if the company culture demands that.
Right.
But they'll expect them to be clean cut, have, look respectable, and the staff and the students will do better because of that. They'll have an easier time developing rapport. They'll have fewer problems if they are all kind of taken care of like that. Another thing that, for example, someone who does business English might struggle with if they come from general English is things like coming up with relatable contexts, because they'll be doing lots of things, but they're going to have to put contexts in the business realm, which is going to be pertinent to their students' needs. And they'll have to be good at things like doing needs analysis and really analyzing, what do my students need to be able to do? Because if my students are an accountant and they never negotiate, well, if I walk in with negotiation skills, my students are going to say, why are we doing this? Or I can even give an example of a time when I failed to do this. It's actually the only time in my career when I've done a demo lesson for a company and not been taken for it.
Why?
And I don't mean for a company like a school. I mean, I was representing a school who was trying to get a tender, and they had lots of meetings in their company. I'd done my homework on them. So I gave them a lesson which was based in speaking skills, how to participate more actively in meetings, like how to interrupt effectively, how to kind of take turns effectively, how to hold your turn effectively. The problem was that the context that I'd chosen wasn't about board meetings. It was about what would you call it? Community town hall meetings. And because even though the skill was absolutely applicable to what they needed, I didn't do a good job of drawing this connection. So actually I didn't get the tender. That's the only time I've ever not got a tender.
They basically just didn't see it relevant to their needs.
Right. Even though it was highly relevant to their needs. And even though I'm pretty sure it was probably more relevant to their needs than whoever got chosen. But I didn't do a good job of drawing this connection, which was my fault, and which is why I deserved to not get that tender. And that's something that general English teachers might struggle with. If you deal with exam preparation, you might find other issues. You might find that, well, you've got to really learn about the requirements of the exam the students are going to take. And you've got to really look at and practice marking and assessing to the standards of the exam so that you can provide meaningful, accurate feedback to the students. Because you don't want to be going in there giving them 10 out of 10 when in reality it was 5 out of 10. And I think the other thing too for exam teachers is making sure that the exam doesn't provide negative backwash on learning. A good example of this is in Ukrainian state school exams, which don't have a speaking component. And because of this, many teachers say, well, if they don't need to speak on the exam, then why do they need to speak in class? Well, but earlier we talked through all the reasons that learners need to speak to each other in class, because full conversation is a big driver of learning, especially for languages. So that means that, well, I could just teach the specifications of the exam, but am I in fact creating negative backwash on my students by doing this? Am I somehow disadvantaging them by doing it in this way? And you can say, well, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Maybe they've got 4 days a week where they study general English and 1 day a week where they do exam prep. And in that day a week, there's just not going to be many communicative tasks. Well, okay, well, maybe then in that case, maybe in that case, you maybe don't need to do that much. Maybe you can focus on the exam like that because it's only 1 day a week. Maybe there's not going to be a significant negative backwash if you do that. And maybe the results are going to outweigh the drawbacks. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the drawbacks will still be significant. It's not necessarily the choice that I would make, but I think it's a more understandable choice. On the other hand, if you only see them once a week and that's all the English that they're studying, now it becomes this point of, well, maybe we do need to be a bit more balanced, even though it maybe is not strictly speaking in exam specification. And I think these are the kind of questions that you've got to deal with if you do exam prep. You've got to really grapple with these questions and think about what the answers are, because we don't want to disadvantage our students in the long term. Like even exam prep classes are still teaching English.
Of course, yeah. Next question. How might you apply this different knowledge while teaching. So, I mean, what does this look like in practice?
Well, I think we've been doing a pretty good job of relating things so far to kind of the practical. But I can give you an example of how I might run a lesson based on what I know about my learners. I can actually walk you through a lesson plan that I'm going to be teaching, hopefully this week if I can get to it.
Okay.
I'm going to be doing a bit of writing with my students. And one of the things that I've noticed they really struggle with is this process of putting pen to paper, kind of drafting, getting their ideas out, and especially editing. That they tend to not have the skill of editing very much. So obviously to help them write, we're providing them with a model.
Yeah.
We're doing several activities to help them with the model. I'm not going to get into them here. But because I know these learners, and I know that right now that the teenagers who I work with, they're the TikTok generation. So part of dealing with them is short attention spans. So in order to kind of get them interested and get them engaged, you've got to really kind of set something that's going to make them want to pay attention for 10 minutes, because they may not have paid attention to something for 10 minutes in a week. So thinking about how to engage them, like setting an engaging activity. In this case, they've got to write biographies. Biographies aren't the most interesting type of writing, but the Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year for a group of boys who are interested in sports is a little bit more engaging. So a nomination for Sportsman of the Year, which is going to have a very large biographical component to it, may be a more engaging task for them. So, okay, so first we go through, we change the task type. Then we make sure they know what to do as they go through, they know how to write it, give them time to research people who they were interested in, to personalize it, and then giving them a reason to read each other's writing. In this case, it's going to be, okay, class time to vote. Let's see who's the Sportsman of the Year. You can't vote for your own guy. So far we'd be dealing with, I would say, more of a general wild issue, which is engagement. But when we get to editing, which is something that they're really going to struggle with, well, there's a few ways I could go about editing and checking writings. I could collect all of their writings, which I'm going to do. I could mark them, which I'm going to do. But even though that's going to be significant feedback, I'm not sure how much of that will be taken in by. That is maybe input, but it may not be uptake. They might just look at it and say, okay, great, thanks. And then that may not affect their future language ever, which gets to the point of, well, okay, so I marked their writing, but how effective was my feedback? I would argue not very, because good feedback should inform what you do in the future. If it's not taken on board, it's kind of failed its job as feedback. Okay, so we think about a different way that we might go about it. Well, I might find common errors that I see them make, and we might correct it all together. And I can tell them, okay, go back, look at your writing, find this mistake. If you find it, correct it. Now, even the most spastic of the TikTok generation can pay attention for the 1 minute that it will take them to do that. Check, they've got, oh, I made that mistake here. Go through, find another common mistake, check, see if you made it. If they haven't made a mistake, great, they still check. Which means they're still practicing editing for this.
So basically, you are doing this, you're kind of giving them a checklist, but they don't do it on their own. Right. You do it as an open class.
Yeah, and in this case, it's not I would make the argument, this is not a teacher-centered activity, but it's a teacher-led activity. They still are proofreading their own, and I might be walking around to help them while they proofread and say, oh, what's this? You missed this one here. And it means that I'm going to be able to focus on fewer errors. Yeah, of course, I'm probably going to be able to keep their attention for 3, 4 if I'm lucky, 5 if it's a miracle, but I would expect 3. I'll probably be able to keep their attention for 3 mistakes there, but those 3 mistakes may, and the feedback to them may result in higher uptake. So it's like, okay, is it better for me to correct 10 mistakes where they may not uptake any of it, or to correct 3 where I'm giving them the opportunity to really learn from it?
Talking about prioritizing things.
Right. And that's a decision that I might not make in an adult classroom. If I were teaching adults, I might go about feedback a bit differently, because I would expect that adult learners would go through and would pay a bit more attention to their feedback, would be making more of a concentrated effort to learn from it. And which in my experience is the case. Like, the adult learners typically want feedback, and the young learners also want feedback, but they've not got the patience to analyze what you're telling them. So you've got to do a bit of the analysis for them and think about how to engage them in feedback in a way that they're going to pay attention to it. So that might be one of the ways, like a concrete example of how I would integrate my knowledge of learners' learning capabilities and readiness in an everyday lesson.
Right. So to summarize our talk today, would you please give a couple of pieces of advice for teachers, how not to make mistakes when going to teach in a different context?
Well, I think the first thing is that you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to finish classes some days and you're going to say, well, that didn't work. And I think the most important quality for any teachers working in different contexts is to be really honest with yourself. And to say, that didn't go the way I'd envisioned it in my head today. Okay, why?
Do some self-reflection, and don't be afraid to admit that, yes, it didn't work, and that's maybe how I did it wrong. But
and remember as well that even if the students, and then the flip side of that is that not to confuse giggling and smiles with learning. Obviously, we don't want the kids to be laying on the floor and crying and beating their heads against the table, but we do want to make sure they're actually learning. So I think one is being very honest with yourself about how the learners are doing, how they're coping with your activities. Are they making progress? Do they seem to be enjoying the lessons? How do they respond to you as a teacher? Do they respond to you? I'm not going to say, do they respond to you well, because that's a bit vague. I'm going to say, do they respond to you in the way that you would like them to, whatever that is? Because every teacher's got a different relationship with their students. You know, I for whatever reason, I tend to have just a little bit of distance between me and my students, just a little bit. But it's a very warm relationship, but there's a clear understanding of,
there should be boundaries, of course.
But that being said, when I see my students in the hallway and they smile and say hi to me, that means, okay, I'm probably doing a pretty good job of reaching that student.
But you were still a teacher for them. You're not a mate, you know. So,
And part of that's that I teach kids, because if it were adults, you know, with adults, I tend to be much more informal. Anyone who's ever taken a adult class with me knows that I tend to be quite informal in those classes. But with kids, well, you know, let them misbehave a little bit, but there still needs to be clear boundaries on what's acceptable and what's not. So that would be thing number one that I would say, is to be really honest with yourself about what's working and what's not working. Thing number two, I would say, is lean on your colleagues and your peers. And don't be afraid to ask for help, even if you find yourself, anytime you find yourself in a new position, because usually they will be happy to help you. Now, granted, there are some schools that are highly competitive environment between teachers. I've worked in schools like that early in my career, and I know how kind of toxic that environment can be. And if you find yourself in such an environment, well, you might think about changing jobs. But a good school is going to have a collaborative environment. The school where I work, well, every school that I've worked at in the last 6 years has had that. And the school where I work now has an exceptional team who all help each other out. And anytime we bring on new people, it's like, welcome to the family. What do you need? We're going to help you get in and teach you how to work with these kids.
Which is healthy, full stop.
Yeah, which is what it should be. So if you find that you can't get help and advice from your teaching, from the other teachers at your school, that's a sign of a very unhealthy environment. So I would really ask how long that you intend to stay there in such an environment, because you also don't want that to rub off on you. And I think the third thing is to, well, I guess as an extension, the second would be to extend, or to give the students the opportunity to give you feedback, and to really pay attention to the feedback that they're giving you. And I don't just, and the students, if you really listen to the students, they will tell you everything that you need to know. Now, I don't mean that they're not going to outright tell you. They're not going to say, teacher, that was unacceptable what you just did. But the look on their face when you do it, when they sit back or their eyes get big, that's a sign to you.
You know, actually, about me, guys, I had a student once who always reacted very weirdly, I would say. Every time I gave task to do, worksheet, the student would look at it like, and it's just the way she reacted to everything.
Well, we've got a problem now that in Thailand, the students are coming back after 2 years of fully online studies. And some of the students, especially those who, let's say, have been less active in their studies in the last 2 years, we were doing a gap filling activity for vocabulary. We just covered the vocabulary, just give them a quick gap fill, check they understand it. Here's a paragraph, put the words in the right place. And about half of my students just looked at it. Teacher.
What?
And I said, I gave the instructions the same way I always do. And they looked at it. Teacher, what do we do? So we did, and we didn't, bear in mind that we had done the first one together. It's not like I've been very careful, done it, instructions, ICQ, do number one together, write in the answer. And this, teacher, what do we do? And I literally had to sit there with 5 of them, hold my book, and we did it one by one while showed them where to read, how to find the answer, elicited the answer from them, and they all would get it about the same time, but they lacked this skill, which sounds a little bit, it surprised me. Now I know about this, so now it's not going to happen again that way, and I know what steps I can take to solve it, but that sort of thing can always happen. And so that's why if you really listen to the students, they'll tell you what you need to hear. But their communication may be things like talking to each other in their L1. Because anytime I hear students talking to each other in L1, I think something's wrong. And lots of teachers say, stop that, or go, or it's like, that's the sign for me as the teacher, something's going wrong. I need to figure out what it is fast. It could be looking lethargic. It could be staring out the window. It could be a look of shock or surprise. It could be a look of boredom. But the students will always tell you exactly what's wrong and exactly how to fix it. But they're going to do it in a way that it might be difficult for you to understand and to be ready to understand them. And they might tell it to you in a way that you're not used to hearing it. And they might tell it to you in a way that you don't particularly like hearing it. But that's your ego talking. That's not you. And that's something that I have to remind myself of as well. And I think the other thing, I guess that the third key takeaway would be that you don't have to change completely. I was actually interviewing a guy recently for a job. I wound up hiring him. And I asked him this question: how would you use your knowledge of Thai learners to help you teach them better? And he thought for a second. He goes, you know what? It's like, I'm going to use it. I'm not going to do anything wrong, but I'm going to lean into the fact that I'm a foreigner. It's like, I'm going to use this. I'm going to I'm not going to try to be a Thai teacher. I'm going to be me from New York. I'm big and I'm loud and I'm, I'm not going to do anything they won't like, but I'm going to take advantage of all of the things about me that I can bring to this. And I really liked that answer because I think it doesn't matter what new context you're in, be it exam prep or business English or new cultures or teaching YL or teaching adults for the first time. there's going to be something about you that's going to resonate, and your way of teaching that's going to resonate with them. And you don't need to change completely. It's making little adjustments. It's, 95% of the lesson might be the same, but you're going to have to figure out that last 5% to make that 95% work.
Chris, thank you very much for this talk. It was incredibly interesting, and I hope that this will help many teachers who have to transition right now. And thank you everyone very much who watched us today. We will see each other next time in our next podcast. Please, if you have any questions or if you'd like to leave your comments, please do that below in the comments, and we'll make sure that we get back to you and answer your questions in our next podcasts. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.